My name's Dee Birkett. I'm Creative Director of Kids in Museums, and welcome to the final, it is the final, isn't it? Or penultimate session of this fabulous conference. We're going to reflect with you for around an hour on what we've been doing for the last few days. And our lead reflectors are Alec Coles, Museum Director, Colleen Dilenschneider, visitor, market researcher, and Megan Cope, artist.
Just on behalf of the panel, we would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Turrbal and Niagara people, and that their sovereignty never ceded in this country. We're in this place is called, Brisbane is Mianjin, and we are near Kurulpa.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Megan. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for welcoming me so much to Brisbane. I'd never been to Australia before, so Brisbane has become Australia to me in that odd way in which if you just go to one place, it becomes it. And of course, whatever happens during this conference, which is the only place I've been in Brisbane, is what Australia is like. So you have huge responsibility. It began very oddly on my very first night here when we went out for a meal, and there was it was a Turkish meal, and there was a woman with very little clothes on and very big. Do you say the word bazookas here? I hope you don't, so you don't know what I mean. Anyway, which were being rubbed in places against other people, and that was my first 2 hours in Brisbane, in Australia. Then I went home to my hotel room, and my kids phoned me and said, "What's Australia like, Mum?" And that was my Australia for my first day here. And that's what I reported back to them. But thankfully, my Australia has now changed due to this fantastically vital, lively and insightful conference that I've been part of. So that's now my Australia, which is marvellous. So thank you very much for that. Now, we're going to reflect on the themes that have bubbled up during the course of the last few days. And just having lots of conversations with all of you, we've boiled it down to basically 3 threads. First is stories. Second is visitor-led. What does that mean? And the third is no gain without pain. So those are the sort of 3 threads from the last few days that we're going to reflect on during this session. So let's first think about stories. Well, Alec, where have we moved? I mean, we've always talked, haven't we, in museums about stories being more important than stuff. So how has that moved on during the last few days?
Oh, thank you for that. Well, I'd like to think it's moved on before the last few days, and certainly moved on now. And I was in the session before lunch, I think it was, and I'm looking around. It's very difficult with the lights. I think it's Tim Kurlovich. Tim here somewhere? Oh, okay. So I can say what I like about him and he can't contradict me. And he talked about us being persuasive storytellers, and it kind of reminded me when I came to Perth about 7 years ago, a very earnest person saying, we're here to tell people stories. I said, well, I don't think we are. I think we're here to allow them to tell their own stories, really. And I think for me that's the message that has to come through loud and clear. And I've seen some great practice over the last few days demonstrated. And it started off, I'm very grateful for MJ for having their kind of council meeting here, because that's why I was here earlier than I would have been. So I went on the tour around the Museum of Brisbane, and the 100% Brisbane project is fantastic. I'm sure most of you have now been to see it. But the opportunity there for people to actually express themselves, I think is a real exemplar for all of us. And we've heard a lot, I think, about how we should, open up our practice. And I know a lot of us have done it. We're doing it in the Western Australian Museum. I think last count, 14,393 people we've talked to in terms of preparing for the new museum in WA. And I guess the other thing, and again, I'm sort of scanning around the audience trying to see who's here, but in particular, and I'm sure Megan will want to reflect on this as well, because her session, took us to the next level, I think, is how we, us kind of white fellas just have to stand back and let, whether it's Indigenous people in Australia or Indigenous people anyway, take the space and create their own place for stories. And because as a director, clearly I don't have an original thought anymore. I did sort of prevail upon my colleagues who are here, several of them here, for their thoughts, and a couple of them said, surely we've got beyond, just telling stories. And I think that's the thing, is not only opening it up and creating those places for dialogue, but actually dealing with those really serious issues. And again, Megan's presentation was absolutely about that, dealing with those environmental issues. And again, last night with Jeff McMullen, everything he talked about last night was really what we're able to do with that. So I think, hopefully, we've got beyond the point of thinking we can tell people stories, but we've actually opening the place up so they can engage in that dialogue themselves.
Yes, Megan, so it's not only about stories, but whose stories are being told, and also by whom.
Always, yeah. Something that I've really enjoyed over the last couple of days is hearing young Aboriginal people's stories and experiences through the institutional landscape, and how the things that they've had to work through, bringing their country and their stories into this space. So that in itself is a story that I hope many people have listened to, and will start to understand the responsibilities that the institution has when it comes to retelling and enabling us to tell our stories, and making space for that. So, and part of that is going into our office and getting outside of the museum. This is something that kept coming up. If we want to tell stories and want to move people and want to really understand, the first part of our history and pre-colonial history and living history now. So, I think.
Megan, can I just ask you, when you say museums need to be responsible, and you said enabling us to tell our stories, what does that enabling look like?
Well, it looks it looks like projects like Gathering Strands, and also this the project with the Menang people in Albany. Yes, there were lots of examples, and that is, process of decolonising our structures. It is self-determination. It is, not just looking at economic benefits. It's creating alternative economies, looking at social capital, cultural capital, and actually aligning them with human action and philosophical understanding.
So that's great, because you didn't say, we don't know what it looks like because it had never happened, but you gave specific examples, like case studies, of where it has happened. So people don't have to reinvent the wheel, do they? There's lots of ways, which I think is really encouraging. That's fantastic that you point to success rather than saying, here's where everything's going wrong. So that's brilliant, brilliant. Should we move on to the visitor-led, because that's something that Colleen, you might have something to say about. What does that mean? We've been a lot about visitors need to design, determine, inform us about our work. What would that look like? What do you think?
I think that was a big theme. I was just in, I'm not sure how many other folks were in this one, but I was just in a session about changing landscapes. And the whole time I was absolutely riveted. There were so many different perspectives. And the themes that were through them were, of course, storytelling, and as Megan mentioned, there's this making space for Aboriginal cultures. But I think that what really captivated me, and it ties back to this being visitor-led, is that there's been such a great amount in the conversations I've been a part of today about community and the so what of the storytelling, or why does this storytelling matter? And it's less talk about just telling the stories, and we're going to tell the stories, and you are moved, go forth and be moved. But more, we're telling these stories, and here's why these stories matter, here's why they matter to you, and here's why they matter to communities. And I think that especially for the conversations that just took place in that session, and also earlier this morning with Gathering Strands and Art of the Skins and the Yeoman exhibition, are kind of, they're bringing people together in a way that's less just telling the stories, and more why these stories matter and why they matter to people. And there's such care and respect in what goes into those things, so that they're so sensitively and appropriately put out, and the amount of care that's put into them is just so. That tells a story in itself, and that's also very visitor-led in itself. And for me, that's just, especially as an outsider in every way, to me, that's a very touching thing, that you can kind of feel the passion and the awareness of the visitor perspective and the storytelling that's happening in these kind of exhibitions.
Alec, what do you think about visitor-led?
Well, again, I think it was Philippa sent me a note, thank you, Philippa, which was the reflection around the fact that we're always putting up barriers, aren't we? We talk about ourselves as a profession, whereas we're more than a profession, and then we talk about ourselves as a sector. And you made the really good point, I thought, that actually our visitors are kind of part of our sector as well, our users are part of our sector, because actually if we're serious about this, we just need to blow away all those barriers. And certainly, again, the practice that we're trying to show, you mentioned the Yeoman, both of you mentioned the Yeoman exhibition down in Albany, which was I actually think it was a game changer in many ways. And it's about letting go. And for so long, we've valued, kind of quite rightly, expertise, but we've used it as a barrier. And I mean, there's nothing, there is nothing new under the sun. There's nothing we'll say down there that you haven't thought and hasn't been talked about before. And yet, it's about walking the walk. And I mean, I'm looking around, I'm quoting all these people who aren't here, and they can't correct me. So I was thinking about what Megan was saying, and one of the most, particularly in terms of working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and one of the most powerful things I've ever heard said at one of these conferences was Greg Lehman. I don't think Greg's been here, but I can't see him in the audience. And he said, the spirit of terra nullius lurks below the floorboards of every Australian museum. And how many of us can put our hands on our hearts and say that isn't actually the case? And so being audience-led, it's far more than about consultation. It is really about letting go. And what I've found interesting, again, you can look at every aspect, just about every session I've been to. I've talked about 100% Brisbane and the opportunity there for 100 people to tell their stories, which is a great example. And so if you've not had a chance to see it, please go and have a look at it. But even when John Ryan was talking, with all the, and there was amazing technology on show there, but if you remember, what he kept going back to was about the human interaction. It wasn't about, it was actually, I suppose, audiences leading each other. It was people talking to each other. And what is what are the selling points of what we do? And I think it's two things, and he touched on both of them. One is what I call authenticity, and it's about, real stuff, and that might be real, stuff you can hold in your hand, or it could be things you can't hold in your hand, which I know people are fond of calling intangible cultural heritage. I hate that term, by the way. As I always say, what could be more tangible to an Australian Aboriginal than a dreaming story? Intangible is a phrase that kind of white Western people invented because they don't quite understand the other side of it. But anyway, authenticity is important. But the other thing is socialization, and the fact that we do stuff together. And that was the point, if anybody was here for John's talk, when I said, I don't actually like to see virtual reality in the museum. Can you do that anywhere? You can do it on a train, you can do it in your kitchen. But actually what the museum has is different to that. So, let our audiences just lead us in those ways. And I think the other thing we have to guard against with that is and I suppose I've expressed before as a cacophony of nonsense. So if you're not careful, you just get all these voices, and it's how you actually facilitate those voices, and that's the real challenge for us. But we've got to make it real.
Thanks. Is there a difference between being visitor-led and visitor-owned? Megan, I think that's really interesting. And whether you said, Alec, white fellows stand back. Is there a possibility even to tell these stories within these white men's structures, which is basically what we've got? Or do we have to dismantle all your structures in order to really tell the stories?
Well, I think that, there's a lot to be learned from Aboriginal culture because, a lot of our histories are shared and there is a lot of collective histories, right? So, our sense of ownership is not in a possessive kind of way, and there's how this works. There is a process of sharing and collective understandings of things, and this is something that white people or institutions can adopt and practice. I think that this is really important. And a lot of people that enter museums and look at public collections, they are looking to find themselves in those objects and histories within that. So there is a very personal attachment and connection to these things that people, then bring into their own everyday experience or histories. So the idea of collective ownership is, whilst it is sort of one of our protocols and cultural practices, it can be learned from, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Should we throw it over, those two ideas, stories and visitor-led, visitor ownership, who owns those stories and who owns those spaces, out to you lot for a few minutes, just a few comments? Anyone want to say something at this point? Feel desperate to reflect upon something they've heard during the last few days, experienced, some idea that's bounced off something, conversation they'd had over coffee. They're all tired. You're all tired, you all need more coffee. I think that's very interesting. Oops, sorry. Behind you.
I think we need to do a better job in community owned. We talk about it, we think it's important, but we need to make it happen.
Thank you. Anyone else? I think that's very interesting. Just my own reflections as creative director at Kids and Museums is we sit outside the museum sector, and museums always say to us, oh, we'll let young people tell their stories. And we always say, what's that word let doing in there? Hand over your space to young people. That's it. It's not about letting people tell their stories. It's about giving ownership of your spaces to people, so therefore their stories grow up in them. So I think that's a slightly different approach, perhaps. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, stories are paramount to our human survival.
Fantastic, thank you.
Maybe it's a tip for next time, but I found it really fascinating to hear the kind of origins of all of these projects. And when it wasn't overt, I asked the question, who made this decision for this project to go ahead? I think that's really important as part of us understanding how, it's not just all about the outcome, it's how the outcomes came to be.
That's a really interesting
starting point.
Thank you, thank you. So should we get to our sort of third big strand, which is no pain, no gain, which sounds very, very topical, and I know that there's been a number of sessions that have touched upon that, and that, Alec, you were at one of those. But you didn't win the prize, but almost.
Yeah, thanks for picking on me on that one. So this was the session, I can't remember what it was called, but I know Paul Bowers and I think Ellie Downing were running it around, and as somebody described, it was a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous, where we all sort of confessed to, our, the worst thing we'd ever done, the worst decision we'd ever made. And it's a bit difficult because it was kind of, it was all, nobody was allowed to tweet, so I don't think I'm allowed to relate anything that went on in there at the time. No, exactly. Not even anonymously. Maybe. All I would say is the winner had commissioned a kind of performance work for an evening event, which apparently involved kind of necrophilia, and she kind of hadn't checked it out beforehand, and needless to say, I don't think she turned up on the night either, so she just got the phone calls on the Monday morning, but that took some explaining to the local press. I think Alan Jones had it on, actually. It was so that was and then the other one I liked was the one where the classic where the cleaner put the artwork in the bin because they didn't realise artwork, and that was good. But one of the points
that's a very interesting point. I think that's a really fascinating point, because actually, why hasn't that cleaner as much a right to decide what's in that space as anyone else? So you've decided that has to go on the wall. They've decided it's not good enough to go on the wall. That's
community curation for you, obviously. But that's. But anyway, the other one I have to say, and I also went again. I'm looking around the room, squinting, but was there's a great demonstration. Some of you will have gone to the Museum of Australian Democracy and their Face Up project, and they were very honest. Kate Armstrong, I think Marnie Pilgrim, if you're still here, talked about that. Oh, there we are. Can I quote? Can I do that quote? Yeah, I can do that quote. And what they'd done, if you didn't go to the session, it was a great session, and thank you. And actually, again, one of my colleagues said what they'd really appreciated about this conference was the honesty, was actually the collegiateness and the fact that people were prepared to share these things. And Marnie described this Face Up project, which involved, take too long to describe it, but using Twitter, where people would record, elements of democracy, but with their face, it'd be like a selfie. And as she said, they hadn't really thought it through. I mean, what had your face got to do with democracy? And, nobody uses Twitter anymore much anyway. It's about the 9th most used, social platform. And I think you got about 15% of the people that you thought were going to engage. And so they did the wash up on this. And the best quote that came back was that somebody had said, yeah, this is the kind of thing that old people would think is cool. And I thought that was a great quote. But anyway, it was just the ability of people to share these things, I think has been really, and certainly, God, there was a lot of sharing in it. What was interesting was the woman who said it was like Alcoholics Anonymous, her worst moment involved alcohol, actually. So it's probably appropriate, but anyway, there we are.
Megan, this idea of honesty and perhaps people's fear of doing something in case they do it wrong. What would you say about that? What do you think, in your reflections of people's bravery and courage over the last few days?
Yeah, well, as you said, there's no pain, no gain. And I think that it's really, really time for institutions to start actually committing to real, solid employment strategies to employ Aboriginal people in these spaces, even if their wages are not subsidised by the government. Like, if we're really committed to these stories, then we need to make space and not, overcome the hurdles. It's not easy for anyone, it's painful for everybody. So I think that, we have to be honest about that.
I think. Do you think there's a fear that the gain isn't for the museum sector in some way, that it's for other people, and that it's a handing over of power?
It's absolutely about that. And, a lot of people worry about doing the wrong thing. Well, I'm sorry, but we are people too, And, I often get asked a lot of questions about, how do I engage with Aboriginal people? I'm like, well, how would you like to be engaged with? Like, you know, imagine that you have this thing that's quite unique and, you know, people want to learn about it. How would you like to be treated in that process? It's really that simple.
That's,
And look,
that's
you
a
know,
great example of honest conversation. And that's really
Yeah.
great example
And I
of
don't
how
know,
important they are.
Yeah.
Great
yeah.
example of that. Experimenting, Colleen.
Yes.
How important is experimenting?
Experimenting is so important, and actually right before we came, when we were going over what we were going to discuss today, and Alec mentioned that he had been at this session where failures were discussed, I was absolutely blown away. In the United States, it's incredibly difficult to get organizations, especially in a public environment, to speak about their failures. It's very brave to speak about your failures, but it's one thing that we always say, and we readily acknowledge it. Oh, if only we could, because that's how you improve. You fail forward. Thank you, private sector, who talks about failing forward all the time, and that's how you grow. But there is, and at nearly every conference, somebody acknowledges it. At the very end, somebody says, "And one of these days, we're gonna talk about failures." But we never do. And the reasons are because stakeholder pride is so high. You don't want, if a board chair had an idea and that idea turned out to be a total dud, nobody wants to admit that. That isn't good for anyone. Donors, you don't want to make them upset. And so that's always this pie in the sky idea that someday we're going to share the time that the janitor threw away the work of art. But we don't share that. We don't talk about that. But we talk about how we don't talk about that. And we talk about how one day we're going to change that. And I think that to hear that that's one of the three themes, to me, is so forward-facing and so hopeful and so innovative, but totally is in the same way. And I'm just so thrilled to hear that these are discussions that are happening and that is a takeaway for this conference. And I think that is a really, really valuable and amazing thing.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say, what if there was no such thing as failure? And what if outcomes were not based on timeframes that were based on financial years, and so, you know, actually not within realistic timeframes. These are like timeframes that exist around money schemes. It's sort of, you know, I think that's a really interesting thing. So when we think about failure, we often, you know, it's because we didn't deliver something with, you know, with a particular outcome that was, you know, set to go in this particular order. Well, sometimes life does not go in that order.
That's a very interesting point. And I suppose going back to our earlier points, is it who draws up those outcomes, who draws up the targets and determines whether it's success or failure, which other people might draw up those targets in very different ways and see very different meanings in them. Fantastic. Now, it's been a great conference, so I think we need to think about what the favourite moments are during this conference. What have been your really top moments? I'm going to ask you lot to contribute, so you can start thinking about that now while I ask the people up here to give theirs. So start thinking about what your very favourite moment has been. Again, it can be, let's think without walls. So it doesn't have to have happened in here. It could be when you're doing karaoke at 1 o'clock in the morning. It doesn't matter where that moment happened. It doesn't have to be within a certain venue or a place or a session. But what's the big moment that you'll, in 10 years' time, remember that you had that light bulb insight at this last few days? Yes.
I'm excited. So mine was when Kim McKay from the Australian Museum, is she here by any chance? Yes. My favorite moment was when you asked who marched for science. And people raised their hand if they marched for science. And then she shared with the group that she did not march for science because she was busy meeting with the United States Vice President Mike Pence. And that she managed to say 7 times climate change, 6 times. That's great. That climate change was important. And I thought, for me, that's such an interesting story coming from the United States, because I'm sorry that you couldn't march for science and you had to do that instead. Thank you for doing that. But for me, it's interesting because this perspective of public trust is so important. And to hear that in an environment like this is really, really resonates and is a really important takeaway. And I just thought it was really awesome that you did that. So that was one of my moments.
Fantastic, thank you.
One of my favourite moments was seeing curator Tess Alas last night receive an award for her exhibition With Secrecy and Dispatch. This is the third award this exhibition has won, so that was really wonderful to see that. And to see her here receive the award. Also, just something that Margot Neal just said before, knowing these stories and songs is knowing where the water is. I found that was a really profound statement in a project that she's been doing about songlines, and seeing this like really incredible dome that they're making that's going to be able to house these stories. That just happened just before, and that's and also sneaking off out of the conference and visiting my nana.
Oh, Megan, you've stolen my best line, I think. Not about the nana, that was a bit... look, there's been so much, and I think I'm turning into an advertisement for the Museum of Brisbane. I hope I'm on commission here, but Phil Manning's tour of the 100% Brisbane exhibition was fantastic. I don't know if you're here, Phil, but thank you if you are. And but also when I was there, discovering Robert Andrews' work in there, who is an Aboriginal artist living in Brisbane, but he's a Yarra man. And again, those that have been will know that we do in Western Australia a lot of work with the Yarra people of Broome. It's a phenomenal exhibition, contemporary art exhibition around Yarra language. So that was a great moment for me. But actually, my favourite moment was last night as well. I'm sorry for those who weren't there, but last night at the dinner, we present the ICOM awards, and I was very privileged as chair of ICOM Australia to present those awards. One for Hetty Perkins, who's a legend, but who couldn't be there, and then, as Megan said, to the Campbelltown Arts Centre for their With Secrecy and Dispatch exhibition. And the reason it was my favourite moment was because it touched on so many things that I think, when they're done well, are incredible. That exhibition, obviously a very powerful exhibition about conflict, about the treatment of Indigenous peoples with great honesty and curated in that way. Very, very powerful messages, and I think no holds barred. Demonstrated the commitment of a local government, actually, that could have shied away from that very easily, but they didn't. And I think it's a great tribute not only to the people at Campbelltown that they stuck with that, but also the local government that funded them. And it was international. It was a great example, working with the artists in Canada as well. And from an ICOM point of view, to be able to demonstrate not only that international connection, but that a regional gallery, because in effect it's a regional gallery, I guess South Sydney, can actually, can win an ICOM award. It's not just about the big museums. So from our point of view, that was great. But what really caught me, and it was when Tess accepted it. And again, for those of you who were there, as she started to describe the Appin massacre, which was the subject of it, she actually broke down. And to me, that there were two things about that. The first thing, just the emotion and the power of what we do is extraordinary, and that's when you really see what, how powerful we can be. And that whole issue of, again, I think Amy, you sent me a note saying, it's about how we make people feel, not how we make them learn, and that was so important. But to go slightly off piece, I suppose the other thing was when she did that, the whole room there was an intake of breath, and there was such an incredible feeling of warmth and support in that room for her as she did that. And you know, to me, I think she felt that, and she picked up and she went on, and that's when this sector, if we call ourselves that, is at its best, when we're together and when we're supporting each other. And at the risk of a slightly spiked remark, which is probably a bit, you know, insensitive, saying I'm sat up here, I didn't attend the members' meeting yesterday, and I understand all the issues behind, you know, are we MA, are we MGA, and, you know, but those of us who live in Australia have seen two political parties pull themselves apart by infighting and by focusing on themselves instead of what they do. And my God, I just hope we don't fall into that, because actually, you know, that's when we're our worst, when we're examining our own navels. When we're our best was last night, when everybody in that room got behind Tess. So I think that was my favourite moment.
Thank you, Alec. Thank you. And I think I'll just very quickly, 1 second, say my favourite moment, which goes back to this notion of the emotion and your power as organisations, that I think is expressed in very, very small ways, which are very powerful ways. It was at the State Library here. I found quite an extraordinary and wonderful place. And there was a little exhibition, and it had one of these cutouts where you put your head through a face for kids to have their photograph taken. And it was a wedding section, and it just had two brides holding hands, and you could put your head through and have your photograph taken as a child. And I just thought, it didn't say anything about it. And I just thought that was a piece of pure power of an organisation like that to used in the most inclusive and positive way, and of which it should be enormously proud. So it can take something that cost less practically to do that, but the power of that is enormous. And I think I won't forget how something that costs nothing could be so powerful and was used by that library in that way. So what are your best moments?
My best moment was the poem this morning, that beautiful illustrated poem by Alice, and in particular, the words that came out of that, the two lines, when we start blaming each other, we leave no room for changing each other. And I think that doesn't just have context within the specific context she was using it, but it applies to all of us in every way.
Thank you.
There was just a fantastic moment yesterday when David Reeve from the Auckland Museum finished his presentation, and his colleague from New Zealand, they sang a song together to celebrate his presentation, and she told this lovely story about if it's a bad presentation, it'll be a very short song, and if it's a good presentation, it'll be a nice long song, and it was a lovely song, so it was great.
Fantastic. Thank you. More positive moments. Here we go, down here.
Well, I like to think I can do it without a microphone.
Great.
So at lunchtime that just happened, I became the Museums Australia Education Network representative for the ACT, for the territory. Oh, thanks. But I want to talk about what happened since then. Since then, I've met other Education Network members. I've been offered resources to run structured gatherings, and I've been able to share the stories of success and failure that I'm going to share with my peers in that territory.
Thank you. Brilliant. Any more? Best moments?
Getting my work out.
Thank you. We'd like to keep you moving around the room. That's very important. Look, I think one of my best moments, I'm Andrew Hiskins from State Library Victoria. One of my best moments was Karen Kint's presentation yesterday, which was about soul searching as a consequence of collection move stress. And it included, she actually ended up going on a 4-day Tibetan retreat. And there are a whole range of other new things that she did. And it occurred to me, and it would be a great thing to do, to think of a keynote which is about how do we look after ourselves in these circumstances, And Karen's presentation was just beautiful because it was quirky, it was humorous, and it was very deep. So it was lovely. Thanks.
Thank you. Someone all the way up here.
I can probably do it out of mic too, actually. My colleagues would attest to that. But my favourite moment is actually the same as Colleen's, but my second favourite was when I wandered into somebody's tour of the 100% Brisbane. It was one done for the conference, but I wasn't supposed to be there. I accidentally found myself there. And they told us about the smells of Brisbane, where you can actually, in part of the gallery, sniff a tube and you get a smell that is associated with people's memories of Brisbane. And I'd never before really thought of, oh yeah, you can make people smell as well as hear and see the memories and people's feelings about a city. And that kind of blew my mind a little bit.
Fantastic. Here.
Once I got over the idea of putting my nose on this piece of plastic to smell.
If I could share my special moment, which happened probably over 12 months ago for this conference. And that was the wonderful discovery of our beautiful lead image for this conference by Megan Cope. That when we found that image, it clearly inspired us in so many ways to this and informed this theme. You know, not only is it a striking artwork, but the way this image was captured with the people viewing that image within a space, in a beautiful museum space, outlooking Brisbane and being mindful of what had come before. But thank you so much, Megan, for not only a wonderful artwork, but providing it for us and the inspiration it led.
Thanks, John. I'll just, on that, it's really, really important for those who weren't in my talk. I just need to say that I would never have made that work without the curatorial vision of Bruce McLean, and that he finally, after 10 years of employment, curated his exhibition, My Country, I Still Call Australia Home, from Black Australia. So without his position in that institution, I would not have been able to imagine my work on that scale. I had worked very small before that. I never saw maps, where maps could go, and he transformed my practice in many ways. So, you know, this is what I mean about museums being really responsible, and the power and, you know, the potential that we have. Yeah.
That's very good. If anyone else got anything, because I think that's a fantastic place to really end on, isn't it? To talk about the power and responsibility of museums, which is fabulous. To thank Colleen, Megan and Alec for their contributions. To thank all of you for your contributions. It's been a fabulous few days talking. Let's all of us go out and do, and make it happen and change now, because we can. So thank you very much indeed.
And can we thank Birkett as well for coming all the way over?